where we're supposed to be talking to each other, but in fact we turn our heads to you. So I just have to imagine that we're doing it in both directions. Charlie, I'm delighted to be here. I know we're here about Kennedy 35, but could we start from a slight other angle? For anyone who writes the sort of books that you do, there is invariably a question that comes up, either up front or during the Q&A. And usually it's not answered. The question being, have you yourself worked for the intelligence services? But luckily, Charlie has actually answered that and in print, and he really did work for I mean, I find that when I do events, people will say, oh, and tell me about your time at the CIA, and nobody even ever called me from the CIA. And they'll say, well, of course you would say that. And, you know, you can't win. But in this particular case...
Where have you seen it in print that I worked for myself?
It's in the front of one of the books.
No, but I think when my first American publisher, there's a useful ambiguity in my career that I did work for MI6, and I really didn't. But my American publisher sort of ran with it and said, former Secret Service recruit Charles Cumming. And it was in all of sort of the blurbs and the PR. Sorry about my American accent. It was on all the blurbs and the PR. But I really didn't.
But you were recruited.
No, I was approached for recruitment, which is very different.
That's good enough for me. I have always been curious about how that works. I mean, what do they really call you in and say?
So he was a family friend. I was 25. I'd been at Edinburgh University in Scotland for 4 years. I was going to say retired. Right? I'd graduated from university. I had quite a good degree, and I was doing really nothing with my life. I lacked ambition, I would say, or sort of direction. And I suppose I always wanted to be a writer. Anyway, I went home for the weekend. So I lived in London. My mother and my stepfather lived in about 2 hours away in a country called Wiltshire. And there was a man there who had been at Eton College with my stepfather 40 years earlier, who said that he had recently retired from the Foreign Office, what we call the Foreign Office, Foreign Service. And at the dinner, during the dinner, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated in Tel Aviv. And I don't know how that news reached us while we were having our kind of quite simple supper, but we got up and we watched the television and the awful reports and what had happened, and it was the astonishment that he'd been assassinated by a right-wing Jewish assassin as opposed to what everybody expected. And I must have said something kind of reasonably politically coherent at that point, because 2, 3, 4 days later, this man was in a supermarket and he supposedly bumped into my mother and said, I so enjoyed meeting with Charles at dinner on Saturday night. Has he ever thought about going into the Foreign Office? And my mother said, no, but he has now. And then a letter arrived, please turn up at such and such an address at such and such a time. And the last paragraph said, given that this letter is personal to you, do not tell anybody else that we've received it, so to speak. And even then I was so dumb I didn't twig. And I turned up and I had a sort of half-hour, three-quarter of an hour conversation with a man of about, I suppose, 40. And it was a beautiful sort of Regency room just off the Mall, you know, just a stone's throw, literally a stone's throw from Buckingham Palace. But the dimensions of the room were slightly off. Like this room is sort of logical, right? But if you imagine this wall is about 2 meters this way, cramped. And so it just felt like, and there was a glass, sort of weird mirror to my right, which felt a bit sort of cramped and strange. And he said, I'm going to leave the room now, but I'd like you to sign the Official Secrets Act. And I said, fine, I'll sign the Official Secrets Act. And then I picked up this file on the table and it said, you're being interviewed for a job with the Secret Intelligence Service with MI6. And I was, by then at least, I had the kind of self-awareness to know that someone was watching me through this two-way glass to see how I reacted. So I didn't stand up and go, yes! I was cool, you know. And I read the file, and it was a very sort of straightforward thing. It said, it even had sort of salary limits, and there was one brilliant line that said, MI6 officers are certainly not licensed to kill. It actually was written down. And then I was away, and he came back, and what did you think about what you've read? And I said, well, I think it's terribly interesting. And we continued to talk for another hour or so, and then he put me into another interview about 2 weeks later. And then they have a thing in the UK called CISB, which is the Civil Service Exams. And so I just went along, and it was it's called Special CISB. You go along with the other people who are being lined up for SAS and MI5, and you do your civil service exam. And at that point, genuinely, that was where my interaction with these people ended. There was one final thing where the family friend, rang me and said, "It hasn't worked out with SAS, but what about MI5, which is everybody knows MI5 is our domestic intelligence." And I think I was so sort of spun out by not getting in that I just said, "No, I'm not interested." And they sort of slightly passionate way and put the phone down, and that was it. But as a writer, I'd alwaed wanted to be a writer, and suddenly this extraordinary experience had just landed in my lap, and it was crying out to be dramatized. So, A Spy by Nature was my first book, which I started 30 years ago almost. And that's, a long-winded answer to your question.
Well, you got your own back. So it begins with the Sainsbury approach to your mother.
The waitress, yeah. That's where the guy approached my mum. Yeah, she was in the frozen food section.
Well, I wish I could learn that. I've always wanted to know exactly what they say when they sell it to you. You're going to do something for your country. I don't know. I haven't faint.
There was definitely a whiff of that. It was Queen and Country, and they try and get you when you're young and impressionable and you don't know much about how the world works. And I was certainly like that when I was 25. I was very, very green. But nowadays it's different. You apply online. You go on the internet and you say, "I want to join MI6," and you fill out various sort of forms and Q&As and logic problems. And if they think that you've got that fissure in your character that suits them, they'll come after you. And there is still the tap on the shoulder, the classic tap on the shoulder where you're at Bristol University or Oxford University and there's a don there or a lecturer who has seen something about you that they think may be of interest to one of the other services, or GCHQ as well. So there is still the old-fashioned way. But I mean, I'm told that because the Chinese and the Iranians and the Russians are looking at our metadata all the time, all the stuff that we're doing online, that if you've shown any interest even in your books, even if you've read a Joseph Kanon book, and then you apply to join MI6 or MI5 online, they will be resistant to your application because it might look later on that the metadata might link you to a sort of an interest in spying, and if they're investigating a legend or a false identity at some point.
Oh, well, that explains it. No readers in Langley.
Yeah.
We go, okay, well, you certainly got your own back, having now written 12 books, most of them centered on MI6.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say. If the material does not come firsthand, where does most of it come from?
So,
a fair answer, by the way, would be I make it up. I accept that.
No, I do. I mean, I really do make a lot of it up. But I did have help. So for A Spy by Nature and for my second difficult novel, The Hidden Man, which I actually really don't recommend, I didn't really know anybody in that world at all. And then a very lucky thing happened to me. I went to a lunch in London with a journalist who knew a guy who was in MI6. And we met and we spoke and we got on, we became friends. There was a great moment quite soon after I'd met him. I was living in Madrid about 20 years ago, and this man came out. He was operationally in Madrid, but he had a night off or a day off, and we were hanging out. And we went to the Bernabeu, the what you call a soccer stadium, a football stadium, to watch Real Madrid, Zidane and Beckham and all that stuff. It was a great game. And halfway through the match, as you saw, I'm very tall, and I stood up I have a bad back, and I was kind of like swaying left and swaying right and back and forth just to loosen my back up a bit. And he said, "Are you sending a signal?" He was that guy. He was always thinking about it in that way. And there was another brilliant moment where quite soon after that, as I said, we hadn't known each other for very long. He sent me an email. This is before Wikipedia and before websites, before there was an awful lot of information about people who were writers and so forth. He sent me an email saying, "Happy birthday" on April 5th. I was like, how the hell does he know it's my birthday? And I was very paranoid. I was writing The Spanish Game, which is basically a novel about a young spy who goes mad with paranoia in Madrid. And my wife at the time was in the bath. And I went next door And it was absurd. I was sort of living in my own movie, and I put the taps on in the bath. I said, "They're listening to us." It was absurd. It was completely absurd. Anyway, our flat in Madrid was not bugged, and it just turned out that maybe 3 weeks before I said, "Oh, by the way, it's my birthday on April 5th," and he sweetly sent me a message to say, "Happy birthday." But to answer your question, whenever I had a story problem or an idea, and I happened to see him, I would say, "I'm thinking about doing this, and I'm thinking about doing that," and he would say, "Well, we wouldn't do it that way. We might do it this way." He never told me anything sensitive that would have got him in trouble, or he didn't want people to know that he was talking to me. But he then became, if I'm honest about it, he was the sort of the basis of the Thomas Kell character in A Foreign Country and A Call to War and Divided Spy. There's a lot of me in that character, but there's also a lot of this person. So I have been helped. But then, I mean, it's the same in your novels. There's so much available to you in bookshelves and online and conversation and so forth. In some ways, one doesn't need an intelligence officer at the end of the phone or on the opposite side of a table you can find it all out. You know.
I mean, sometimes I feel we're part of a feedback loop.
Yeah.
Where, someone who actually has worked at Langley writes a book, and then we take details from that, and it feeds back onto itself in the same way that the language has. I mean, I've noticed I think it was in Kennedy 35, but one of the recent books, Closers, which is terrific, which are the bad ops in the field. Then Tentacles was used for listening devices, and I thought, is this your invention, or do they actually use it?
Listen, I tell you, no one's ever mentioned this, so for you to mention that is amazing. But I did, yeah. I mean, the world building I did was to invent Closers, to invent Tentacles, and in exactly the same way that the circus,
the Le Carre thing, is
just
just
lamplighters and moles, and that's all David Cornwell's about.
And they came to use it. My favorite of all of those feed loops was when they were shooting The Godfather, and they would go to made men to get fashion advice. And they'd say, what kind of clothes would he wear? And then they wore them in the movie, and then they wore them on the street because they'd been wearing them in the movie, and so it goes into this loop.
Yeah. All
right, so there you are with all this information at hand and sort of experts to consult if you want that. But fundamentally, these are works of clever fiction, and the ops in the field are of your devising. Fair enough. There are now 12, I think, and this is the third in the Lachlan Kite series. How close is he to home? Is he close to you?
Yeah, he's of the male protagonists. I mean, I've always really written from a male point of view. He's the one who's sort of closest to my heart, or closest to my biographical fallacy, as they would say at universities. Is it Graham Greene who said a writer's bank balance is his childhood? And I'd never really written about my childhood before. And I had everyone's childhood is unusual. Mine was eccentric. My mother and father divorced when I was 7, and my mum fell in love with and married my dad's best friend, his business partner, who was my godfather, a wonderful, wonderful man who sadly is no longer with us. And they had a very happy marriage. And there's nothing more normal than your own childhood, and I just sort of absorbed that. And my mother and my stepfather bought a hotel in the southwest corner of Scotland, in a county called Wigtonshire, near a beautiful village called Port Patrick. If anybody's ever in Scotland, go to Port Patrick. It's called Knockinarm Lodge. And in box 88, the first book in this series, Lachlan Kite is his mum, who is not based on my own mother, his guy, is running Killantringan Lodge, but that's the same. Right. And his father, sadly, has been killed. He's an alcoholic. He's died. My father's very much alive and well. But so we share that, but principally also we share this strange thing that a certain type of British mother and father does to their parents in my country, that they send them away at 8 to boarding school. And so quite soon after my mum and dad divorced, I conducted a sort of 500-mile journey south to Wokingham in Berkshire and went to a preparatory school, a prep school, in fact, where Prince William and Prince Harry went, called Ludgrove. And I think I'm still famously the most homesick boy that ever went to Ludgrove. So I was pretty sort of stirred up by this experience. Kite in Box 88 doesn't go to Ludgrove, but he goes to the school that I went to afterwards called Eton, which is the famous school that you know, of course, and I've called it Alford College. But he has this same sort of disorienting experience of leaving Scotland, leaving Kilntringham Lodge, Knockingham Lodge, and going south into a highly privileged, rarefied ecosystem with great traditions and strange dress. Attorneys wear sort of tailcoats and all the rest of it, and a secret language, much like lamplights and moles. They have teachers are called beaks, and if you do a bad piece of work, you don't just get a nasty thing at the end of the thing. Do better, Kanon. They actually rip it. It's like a strange, things for a 13-year-old boy to deal with. And I thought that in my country there's a huge amount of interest and frankly kind of prejudice against Eton because of Boris Johnson. And, there's a sort of cabal of conservative politicians who frankly sort of ruined the country or set about ruining it. As well as all sorts of very interesting artistic attorneys like Hiddleston and Dominic West and David Lewis and George Orwell, God bless him. And I thought this is a good opportunity for me, bank balance childhood, to show people what it's like to be at this school. So in Box 88, it's not a huge amount of the novel, but Kite's is basically a kind of working class kid who is plunged into this very strange school at a very young age and has to sort of survive on his wits. And he makes a great success of it in a way that I didn't. So Kite is a kind of a new, improved version of me in every single dimension. He's kind of cleverer, more hardworking, better with women, and gets into MI6, which I didn't.
And I must say, one of the pleasures of these books, I mean, I know we're supposed to be in the post-Ian Fleming generation and everything is very serious and weighty and filled with gravitas. But one of the pleasures of these books is that you're really a very high, or the characters are really living high. I mean, they know their way around the bar. They know what to order. As I was reading this, I thought, God, if we ever have dinner, I'm going to let him order the wine. Obviously knows what he's doing. And it's a joy. And where you get the right haircut in St. James and where you know.
Truth and Will,
yeah. All this kind of stuff, which is its own small pleasure, but it adds to a reading pleasure, and it's fun to see it in the book. Can I ask, though, this is the third in a series. I've never done a series, and I'm curious to know what you think the plus and minuses are and what the experience was like.
Yeah. I think there's sort of two reasons. The first reason, which I should probably sort of get over pretty quickly, is a commercial decision. That I think in order to survive as a writer in genre, in mysteries and thrillers, in spy novels, it became increasingly apparent to me that I couldn't do what you do, which is have a blank sheet of paper with every book and sort of rely on my name and rely on my brand. I did a novel called The Man Between, which came out here called The Moroccan Girl, which just didn't do well at all. And I was looking at Mick, the Slough House, Mick Heron and the Slough House series, and it was really taking off. And it just made sense for me to think in those ways. I'd obviously done series before. I did 2 Alec Milius books and 3 Thomas Kell books, but with Kell, I'd really kind of sealed it off and didn't want to do it anymore. And I thought, probably at that point I was 46, 47. And it made sense to really to think long term. So there was that thought, there was a commercial thought. And then secondly, I think the advantage of a series is that you can do an enormous amount with character and with relationships and with sort of political content and time. So I'd gone to my editor in London, Julia Wisdom at HarperCollins, and I said to her, when we can sort of come onto this at a different time, but the mobile phone was really kind of hindering my books. The technology was hindering my books, which I can explain later. But I said, I want to go back to the 1990s, which is the sort of the decade that the spy novel forgot, because really there were no spy novels before you. Any spy novels that were contemporary to the 1990s, except for John le Carré, because it was sort of Berlin Wall, end of history, no more spying, and then 9/11. I said, I want to fill that 11-year, 12-year gap, and have old school tradecraft, before Google, before mobile phones, before satellites, before number plate recognition cameras, before retinal, all the stuff that gums up contemporary spy stories, in good ways and bad ways. And she said, that's a great idea, but it's a shame that you've built up this reputation as a 21st century spy novelist, and just to throw that all away. So I thought, well, I'll do both. And so that was my series idea, was to have, to track the life of Lachlan Kite, basically. So you see him as a 10-year-old at the hotel in Scotland with his mum. His dad dies. He gets sent off to this elite school. In his final summer at that elite school, he's recruited into this mysterious Anglo-American spy agency called Box 88. And they say, go and spy on your best friend's family in the south of France, because they've got an Iranian staying there who's of interest to them. And then the sort of USP of the series is that you then see Kite in the present day. So you have him as a young man, and then you see him when he's my age, sort of 27, 50, 51, 30 years later, and he's experienced. He's kind of gone through personal and professional hell as well as great successes. He's finally found a woman that he settled down with. He's got a child on the way, and he's running. He's very senior in Box. He's running the sort of European operations for Box 88 in London. And I just thought that was an interesting kind of thematic idea, and the world building of it appealed to me. And so the idea is that there's going to be 7 or 8 or 9 of these books, from the fall of the Berlin Wall to 9/11. That's the Kite's young life. So I know what happens in the 9/11 book, but between here and there, it's all a bit sort of foggy. But yeah, so the series advantage is I don't have to do what you do, which is new characters, new world every time. Well, not every time, but a lot of the time. Your books are standalone, and that's a lot of hard graft and a lot of imaginative work. Plus, what you do is, I think, is historical novelists, I think, have the hardest job of all, because not only are you spinning the plate of character, spinning the plate of story, and spinning the plate of relationships and politics, but you're also, how did people talk? How did they dress? What did they eat? What did they drink? Where did they get their haircut? There's so much. I completely lack the bandwidth to do a historical novel. I mean, before my own time.
That's often part of the appeal of doing it, is the research, etc. Yeah. And I mean, my first book was set in 1945, and I think I've got as far as 1962 or 63 in this thing. My wife says that if I keep going, I'll write a contemporary book before I die. So that'll be interesting. But I like writing, period, in some ways, because I don't want to do cell phones, and I don't want to do the technology that I myself am really poor at and don't understand. And this notion that everything is known, if everything is known, and I thought, but there can be nothing more dramatic than somebody meeting on a park bench and just slipping something in a newspaper. I mean, just as corny and old Cold War style as that can be intensely dramatic, as opposed to somebody slipping in a CD disc and seeing everybody's life in front of them.
No, it is talking of.
Do you find it limiting in any way?
No, I did find it limiting. It's basically a mobile phone is going to allows a protagonist or a character to call for help. It gives them a map.
Yeah.
It allows them obviously to be tracked, to be listened to be blown up if somebody's got to the phone in time. And even if the phone is switched off or inside a Faraday box, it's still, why has it been switched off? Or even if you're not using it, even if you're not texting, you're still leaving a kind of snail trail of metadata and all the rest of it. So in one of your novels, let's say you're an intelligence officer and you're recruiting me, I'm in the KGB or whatever, and you're in the CIA, we meet in a park, on a park bench, and we kind of clean our tail, make sure nobody's followed us, and you do the same, and we meet and we go, I'll see you at 12 o'clock in 3 weeks' time, and here's the information, and off we go. And it's personal, and it's atmospheric, and it's you're just concentrating on those two characters and the tension that they're both under, the pressure that they're both under, which is basically sort of surveillance pressure. In the present day, if you and I meet if you're running me as an agent, and we meet in Starbucks, and we've left our phones at home, so we're not followed. Why have you left your phone at home? How do you account for that? Why is your phone switched off? Or if your phone is on, why were you in Starbucks at the same time that Charles Cumming was in Starbucks? Because because the metadata shows that you were both there. It's too much of a coincidence in the middle of Moscow, CIA officer Kanon and KGB officer Cumming were, so you're always having to think about that. So in fact, in Judas 62, the second of these books, I tried to show both worlds. So you have Kite in '93 going into immediate sort of post-Soviet Russia. Voronezh, city Voronezh was a couple of hours south of Moscow, and he's just alone. He's sent in to befriend and basically persuade chemical weapons scientists to come out before the Koreans or the Iranians were grab him. And he doesn't fly. This guy's like Mr. T, so you've got to get him out by road. And Kite gets in a lot of trouble, and he's under a lot of pressure, and he falls under suspicion. But he can't call for help because it's 1993. He can't pick this up and say, "Mummy, come and get me." If he wants to make a phone call, he can't go to a call box in Voronezh in 1993 and 0044. He has to book the call at the local post office, and then guess who's listening to the phone call. Right? So I was showing all of that old school tradecraft, which is sort of the grammar of your novels and Le Carré's novels and Dayton's novels. It's just how do you survive as an individual under that kind of pressure? And then in the second half of Judas 62, you have the older Kite going to Dubai, 21st century, all singing, all dancing, Dubai, which is like an off-world planet, of all-you-can-eat surveillance. There's CCTV everywhere. Anytime you get in a car, it's like, bloop, bloop, bloop. They know exactly where you are and whichever road, whichever freeway. As soon as you go through airport security, they've got your eyes. They've even got the way that your gait, G-A-I-T, or the way you walk. So Kite has to go into Dubai as Lachlan Kite, which is completely kind of counterintuitive for an intelligence officer. Like, I'm not going to go in as myself, but he has to because he's been there before. So if you go in and pretend to be Mike Smith, alarms are going to go off, and he's going to be grabbed, and he's going to be in prison for 5 years. So all of that stuff, it's quite fun. You can use it, of course, but it does hinder, in some way, sort of suspense and isolating a character and really putting them under pressure. How do they get out of this bind that you put them in? Because in the simple ways, like you can put them in a place where there's no mobile phone signal, but how many times can you do that? So that was a problem for me. That's what I said to my editor at the time. I said, "This is it's the mobile phone problem, it's the Wi-Fi problem." As you say, everybody knows everything about us.
It's without spoiling no spoiler alerts, and I'm sure people are eager to read it anyway. But this truly ends in a wonderful cliffhanger where you're set up for the next one, so to speak. So I assume there is going to be a next one. Can I ask this without giving anything away? Will we see Martha again?
Oh yeah. Funny, when I was I was at a memorial service about a year ago, just after the last Bond film had come out, where they killed off Bond, which I thought was disgraceful. And Barbara Broccoli was one of the people at this memorial service, and Barbara Broccoli being the woman who produced all the Bond films. And I thought, Charlie, you've got to talk to Barbara Broccoli. So I waited, and she was leaving, and I thought, I'm going to go and talk to her. And I went up to her and I said, I'm about to do a very bad New York accent, so I apologize. I went up to her and I said, I have to just ask, will James Bond come back? And she looked at me absolutely, she went, what do you think? Of course he will. So yeah, Martha, who's slightly less well-known cultural icon, will definitely be back. But that's the juice of those books, is that relationship that they meet when they're kids, basically. They're both sort of high-functioning, lovely, young, intelligent people. They fall in love in France in '89. And she doesn't know, initially, who Kite is. He's hiding a big secret from her. He's there on that holiday to spy on the family, to spy on his best friend. And then she's involved in Judas, sort of almost accidentally in the Russian side. And then in this book, she has a role to play. I mean, I think maybe it's not too much of a plot spoiler that Martha was living here. She was living in New York with her American husband because they had this great sort of Fisher, Kite and Martha in the early 2000s. So she comes over here and has 2 kids, but her marriage has ended to this American man, and she's gone. In this book, she's come back to London to stir things up with Kite and his happy new marriage. That's I'm sort of still answering your question about series. That's a lovely thing. You can just sort of track them from book to book, and it's people they fall in love with the characters. They want to go back to Jack Reacher or Sherlock Holmes or Jackson Lamb. It's not what happens, it's who it happens to is the, I think, the kind of iron law of all storytelling, really.
Now I think the readers demand it. I mean, look at Conan Doyle, who had to rescue him.
Bring him back from the dead.
And the Stephen King book where he kept breaking his feet, so that he'd write the books. I don't want to get into that. It's too grim.
Yeah.
One of the reviews that you've received, which is quoted on, I think, more than one of the books, is that you write spy novels for the 21st century. And aside from the technology issue, it seems to me that one of the things that begins to happen and defines the contemporary spy thriller is that the settings become more and more not exotic. I mean, that would be the wrong word here, but foreign to us.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even in the Box 88 series, we go from the south of France, which I think is intuitively known by your readership, I mean, by most people in this country, to post-Soviet Russia, which again, you can imagine somebody walking down the street and not being taken for the person that he really is. And now we go to Senegal and into a culture completely unknown to most of the people who might be reading these books.
Yeah.
And I thought, A, it's hard to do, and so B, I was curious, do you spend a lot of time in places, or do you rely on the kindness of strangers? I mean, how do we do this?
Well, both. I mean, for this book, I had in my head an image of Kite and Martha on a beach as 22-year-old backpackers. They were on a beach in East Africa, in Kenya, and they were operational. That's all I knew. Kite had been sent there to do something. And I was all set to go to Kenya to do this book. I had diplomats, I had journalists, I had spooks, I had everybody. And then I thought, I'll just look at the Foreign Office advice, and it was just after the pandemic, or what the French called and I looked at the UK Foreign Office advice, and it said, if you go to Kenya, pal, you're going to have to quarantine for 10 days when you come home. And my wife had just had a baby, so she said, "You're not doing that." So Kenya was off. I mean, this, and then I looked at where I could go, where I didn't have to, and it was Morocco, and I'd done a book in Morocco. South Africa, which is a whole other thing. Ghana, which is Anglophone, and then just this piece of luck, Senegal, and it was much better than Kenya, much more interesting than Kenya. It's francophone. It's a staggering place. And I went in October, not knowing, a bit like I've come this week, and it's Thanksgiving week, like great week to promote a book. I went to Senegal. Never go to Senegal in October. It's the hottest you've ever been. It is literally like being in a sauna all the time. It was a fantastic. I was put in touch with a guy called, brilliantly named Alpha Sec, who was a local Senegalese guy, sort of young 30-something guy, who was sort of showing me around, helping me out. And we've been hanging out for a couple of days. And I've been invited by an American, actually, who worked for an NGO, to go to our house for dinner. And I've just been sweating and like jumping around. I thought, oh, thank God, a dinner in an air-conditioned, all expenses paid NGO house in a nice part of Dakar. And I went with Alpha, and we walked through the gates of this lovely house. And to our despair, there was a sort of trestle table laid out in the garden, 80% humidity, candles. Like, oh no, please. And I tell the story because it's very funny. This is how hot it was. Alpha was sitting sort of some way down this trestle table, and I looked up at a certain point, and he'd gone. He disappeared. And he came back about 20 minutes later. I said, "What happened to you?" He said, "I went home to shower." And he lived 10 minutes away, and he was so hot, he'd gone home to shower and change his clothes and come back to the dinner. So he was local, but it was that hot. But it was very lucky because it added to the atmosphere of the book, and all of that heat and chaos and not knowing where you are, and the trip and the tech not working in 1995, the radios fail, the walkie-talkies don't work. Kite is again completely isolated and has to work things out.
One last question before I turn it to the audience. Having not got into MI6,
Thanks.
you then created Box 88, which MI6 only sort of knows about, and the CIA sort of know about. Do you want to do the origin story for your readers?
I'm not very interested in office politics, and I'm not very interested in ministerial rivalries and politicians sort of signing off on things. In the real world, in MI5 or in SIS, if you want to mount an operation, you have to get it cleared by Bob and Mike and Sally and Amanda and then the Home Secretary or the Foreign Secretary. Just there's a lot of oversight. And the beauty of Box 88 is that it's very good people from the American side and very good people from the British side and all parts in between, and they're not answerable to anyone, and they can just go off and do the stuff, sometimes moral, ethically dubious stuff that MI5 and SIS wouldn't do or can't be seen to do. And it's sort of in the tradition of the Mission Impossible unit, really. Frankly, but I did have a lunch with a guy who had recently retired from MI6 when I was planning Box 88, and I said to him, "Look, I'm thinking of doing this thing. What do you reckon?" And he literally went, "I was so sure there was a thing like that when I was working there." So I thought, "I'm fine."
We did say, "How do you know?"
Yeah.
I've been gabbing, but you may have very different questions. Does anyone in the audience have a question for Charlie? Sure.
And for these series like the Kite series, how do you plot the books that haven't been written well ahead of time? Do you have sort of a general or more specific thought about what you're going to do with these books and in fact how many? And
I have a general sense. I know that Kite's life from this point on, from 95 onwards, sort of doesn't spiral out of control. His personal life sort of spirals out of control. I know that. And I'm not sure of the specifics, but I know that his relationship with Martha is going to be under a lot of stress, and as well as the professional stuff that he's asked to do. And as I said earlier, I know how the last book ends, but I'm not a world builder like a sort of J.K. Rowling or something like that, where it's all sort of mapped out in my office, and I leave myself a lot of wiggle room. So the fourth book, I've got that worked out. I'm researching at the moment, about to start writing it. I'm going to Athens on Monday, and then the Balkans. I'm driving through the Balkans next week. I don't go home much. But so I've got that story worked out, but I find them quite difficult to do, these books. I'm not a sort of Anthony Horowitz or John le Carré who leaps into his office in the morning and goes, the muse is here again. And I'm just not like that at all. I mean, whatever the opposite of that is, that's me. So are you like that? But you go to the New York Public Library and things are just flowing, aren't they? It's just annoying.
No, you just sit down and work. Just do it. Yeah. Which is what you do too. But
I do work hard, but I don't find it easy.
Well, it's never easy.
Are you a procrastinator? Do you find that you come up with excuses to not start?
Yeah. If anybody is on chess.com, my handle is Lachlan Kite. I'll play you anytime. I play a lot of online chess. I don't know. I don't know if Joe's the same, but there's nothing like a deadline to focus the attention. And I think probably one subconscious works so hard from, like now with this fourth Kite book, my subconscious is doing a lot of work. And when I come to writing, the things will appear. Because traditionally what's happened with my books. And then the closer you get to the finish line, and the more sort of Ottos ring you up going, "Where's my book?" The solution presents itself and you get a lot done. But yeah, no, I'm a huge procrastinator, which apparently is a sign of depression. I don't want to interrogate that too much.
It's what happens also is that at a certain point, things click in and you enter a kind of fugue state. You're here, but part of your mind is still actually in the books, and we're working out something, figuring it out. She'd never, you could be walking home from the library and you think, she'd never say that. That's just not what she would say. And nobody's aware that you're thinking this. They just think you're looking at the trees or something. But you're totally bemused by it. And I think it's one of the pleasures of writing, is it does take you out of yourself.
Yeah, and when it's going well, there's nothing like it. And when you have good ideas and come up with a good idea for a scene, whatever, it's very pleasurable. And making it better is a great part.
Writing is rewriting.
Yeah. And then and then editing the galleys is awful. But up to that point, it's quite good.
So, Joe, I know you do a lot of research. We've had this conversation. And I'm curious, and of course, your novels are sort of historical novels, but I'm curious whether, Charles, you do research in addition to sort of traveling and experiencing the places that you're going to set the novel.
Yeah, no, well, so with Kennedy, there's lots. The basic plot of Kennedy is that Kite is sent to Senegal on the trail of a Rwandan Hutu genocidaire, war criminal, who was running a radio station in Rwanda in 1994 based on Radio Mille Collines, which is the sort of forerunner of, I don't mean to be glib, but a sort of forerunner of Twitter in a way, in the sense that they propagated a huge amount of hate and fake news, if you like, to the Rwandan population on Radio Mille Collines, encouraging them to murder their Tutsi neighbors and friends. And the people, the Hutu people of Rwanda, many of them did do this awful thing. So I read a lot of stuff about that. There's the famous Gurevich book, We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed. And there's an amazing novel by a Canadian writer, which I'm now going to forget the name of, Sunday by the Pool in Kigali. Incredible book. But it was the same with Judas 62. Just because I couldn't go to Voronezh during the pandemic, I read a book about somebody who luckily had been there at exactly the time that Kite was there, so I could see what the shops looked like and what food they were eating and how they got around and so forth. So I do a lot of reading. This is Paul Vittich asking this question, because you do too. Online and books and talking to people. Talking to people.
So it's sort of one of the things about research, and I think it's true of your novels, I think it's also true of mine, is that there's always the historical context, which is to some extent accurate. There's an historical moment, there are figures who are historically real, and then into that, you sort of place your characters. You sort of create a novel within a historical moment. And I assume that sort of helps you sort of establish the setting, the place, the atmosphere, by virtue of the fact that you're sort of parachuting, if that's the right metaphor, into a time and place.
It's important that it be something that could have happened.
Right.
I mean, even if there were, quote, real people in it, or your version of these real people, it has to be a story that could have played out simultaneous to the story that we already know.
Right.
I think that's crucial. Otherwise, it's, you're just rewriting history, and nobody's going to believe it.
Tale of Two Cities, Charles Dickens, is exactly that. It was written in 1858, and he had never been in that, in sort of the trauma of the French Revolution. But he had read all of this stuff about the French Revolution. And so you feel like you're living the French Revolution, even though he was making it up based on the research that he did.
Well, Paul, would you, for my next book, write a blurb that says, not since Charles Dickens.
Let's do one joke to finish off, because this reminded me of an episode of Cheers, where Frasier is trying to encourage Cliff and Norm to read more literature. So he gets out of Tale of Two Cities, and he, that Frasier way, and he says, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." And Cliff says, "Which was it?" So it reminds me of that.
Now, are we going to have Charlie sign some books?
Yes. And this is the time. Can I just say, this is such an honor that you did this. Thank you so much, and for everybody coming here in the rain, but to be interviewed by you, I really